So, hello everyone. Today, what we're going to be talking about is doing interviews for the purpose of social research. This, for me, is my favourite form of research. It's qualitative research. I enjoy it. I enjoy doing focus groups and other sorts of group work as well, including a project I did at Flinders University back in 2013 where we did group work and people wrote stories and then we talked about those stories in groups, divided into small groups, and then had a large group discussion. And that was called a feminist memory work project. But I still think of all the forms of research that I do, interviewing is by far my favourite. And it has become a very popular form of gathering or generating data as well. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And in workshops, what we're going to do is practice doing some interviews so that you get kind of a bit of a taste of it and see whether you like it. Some people don't. But lots of people do, and I'm one of those. So we'll cover a few of these things, why we do it, what the aim is, and I'll kind of go through some of the types of interviews you can do and some of the problems as well. And I must admit, and let me say this right at the beginning, the best way of learning how to do interviews is actually doing interviews, and I have probably made every mistake there is to make about doing interviews, but every one of those mistakes has made me better at it as well. So these are guidelines, but if this is a form of research that you think you might like to do, I would encourage you to do it and suggest that you'll learn on the run. You can take all the advice from all of us, and that's a good thing to do, but doing it is absolutely the most effective way of learning. So let's get into it. This is a quotation from Rosman. A few years ago now, interviewing is described as the hallmark, the best, the pinnacle of qualitative research. I'm not sure everybody would agree with that. If you really like working with groups of people and prefer doing a focus group, and a focus group is in many ways like a tutorial group but run for the purpose of gathering research. But what a focus group is a small group of people, and the intention there is to gather the energy and the dynamics of a group in order to generate lots of information. Because in a group, somebody says something and it triggers the memory for somebody else, and then the conversation just kind of snowballs in often quite an exciting and fun way. So this is not to downplay other forms of research if that's what you prefer to do, but for many of us, this is the best thing because it's how you get right up and close and personal with somebody and get to understand them, what's important to them, and the meanings. It's very much about meanings, how people generate meanings for themselves in the world. Now, you will have already been a part of, engaged in, perhaps conducted lots of interviews already. So just an informal conversation is a form of interview in a way. If you think about asking somebody how their day was and then following up with inquiring after friends or family members, what happened on the weekend, etc. That's kind of that's an interview really. So you're going to be calling on skills to do an interview that you already have. When you go to a doctor, you're being interviewed by the doctor. Perhaps you're also interviewing a doctor if you're wanting to get a second opinion. You will have seen lots of journalist interviews on the television or heard them on the radio. There are interviews, of course, for immigration, for people who are being assessed as to whether we want them to stay in the country or to enter the country. Some of you probably have done job interviews already, and they can be a one-on-one process, they can be a group process, they can be you in front of a panel of people as well. A television interview, you will have seen those as well, many of those. It's quite a common form of conducting conversations on television. And a therapeutic interview, if you've been to a counsellor, then really that's kind of what's called a therapeutic interview, a counsellor or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, somebody who's wanting to I guess, act as a sounding board and help you think through things for the purpose of improving life for you, then that's a therapeutic interview. So there's lots of ways in which interviews are routine in our everyday life, right from that very informal conversation, as I said, through to something where you're intending to be interviewed by somebody in order to help you work through your problems in life. And the interviews that you do in social research call on lots of the skills, the interpersonal skills which you already have. So the reason why I like it, as I said, it enables me to understand people, and it means that we can obtain really, really rich and detailed data about how people view and experience their worlds. And that's what I love about it, that rich detail. I guess what happens is that I get to peer behind the curtain of somebody's life. And because we all put up a front, we're all performing from time to time, but in this way, it's quite an intimate thing, I guess. You get to see behind the scenes a bit, and that's intriguing. It's very informative. It's very humbling in many ways, and I develop just the most enormous respect for people whenever I do that sort of interview with them. It's a very flexible. You can do it over the telephone. You can meet in a cafe, which is fantastic. I've conducted interviews on campus as well, in quite a formal office, even in my office where there's a desk. It's probably not ideal, but it has worked. You could go and interview somebody in the park. So it's very flexible. You can do multiple interviews as well. I've been interviewed and somebody's come out to my place 2 or 3 times in order to do what's called an oral history interview, which takes a long period of time. But you could do that. I haven't done that with people. I don't interview multiple times, but you could do. You could interview somebody once, and then you might want to go back and say, well, we had a chat about this. Is there anything else that you've been thinking about this particular topic? So you could do that as well. And I have interviewed people in restaurants, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Perhaps not ideal, but it's very flexible. However, I guess on the downside is that they are unpredictable. People can pull out at the last minute when you've organised something. You don't know whether they might sign up for an interview and look like they fit the interview criteria, and then you discover that they don't. I remember at one focus group, the difficulty that I had with a young person who wasn't yet 18 who wanted to join in the discussion. She was 17, and theoretically, I shouldn't have included her in that study, and I didn't have to make the decision on the spot about whether I would or wouldn't. All of the information we sent out included the fact that the participants did need to be 18. I let the person stay, but that's kind of the unpredictability there. Part of it was because she'd arrived, she was there, she was obviously very keen, she'd seen the material, she wasn't that far away from 18. I thought, well, why not? But you never know. So things can happen. People can just not turn up as well. And it is also very time consuming because there's the organisation that you have to do beforehand, and that's not even talking about the ethics process, but there's a lot of time involved in setting up mutually agreeable times because people are very busy, so you need to set up a time that's good for that person and good for you as well. It takes a while. An average interview might take 45 to an hour, and then there's time involved in transcribing the interview afterwards. So it's not a quick process, and that needs to be taken into account when you're doing any sort of project as well. Successful interview requires people to have a genuine interest in people, because you do get very up close and personal with them, and if you're not interested, you're not actually going to generate very good data, because people know you will have had conversations with people and they're not really interested and they don't really care, and therefore that limits the amount that you tell them anyway. So in order for an interview to be successful, you do need to be interested in the person in front of you. You might not like them, but you have to be interested in them. The skills that you need, and these, as I've already said, you will have in many ways anyway. You need to be able to set aside your personal judgments and criticisms of people, put them at the door, pick them up when you come out if you like. But during the time of doing the interview, you need to have an attitude of being non-judgmental. Easier said than done. I'm sure that at times that I have been judgmental when somebody said something that's really surprised. And in fact, what's happened when I've transcribed interview data, I can hear some sort of criticism sneaking into my tone or the way in which I ask a question. So that's something that you learn to, over time, just put aside and try to be as open to that person and non-judgmental as possible. The way in which you frame questions can make a difference as well. One of the problems when people begin interviewing is they often ask a lot of closed questions. So, did you enjoy that? Is it okay to talk to you about this? Questions that invite a yes/no response. Now, there are some people, and it won't matter how you frame a question, and they'll happily tell you everything. And that's fine. There are other people at the other end of the spectrum where you might be asking very open questions and they only give you, monosyllabic answers. But in between are a whole host of people who actually like to be encouraged, and the way in which they frame the question is important there. You do need to listen. I think that in successful interviewing means that you're a bit like a duck. You know how a duck is swimming along and it looks like they're just gliding on the water, but underneath their feet are working very, very hard. So you might be thinking, well, this is going a little bit off track, or I don't know if I need to check my equipment and make sure that it's recording properly. I hope this person is okay. They seem a little bit uncomfortable. So you've got all this stuff going on in your mind, but the stance that you need to have to the other person is one of attending to them, of listening, of using your body language, open body language, nodding, using everything that you've got to encourage them to speak through an attitude of listening. And moreover, it is by the careful listening that you'll be able to move on and ask questions that'll probe a little bit deeper as well. You'll notice some things. And you do want to get beneath the surface. So if you do an interview and it doesn't take very long, then you probably haven't gone beneath the surface. And the person's just told you a few things, but to really get into their mind and into their idea of how the world works, you need to ask some probing questions. So tell me a little bit more about that. Is that so? Can you just explain that a little bit more? And sometimes you might want to summarize as well, and then and say, is that how you see it? And even if you make a mistake in that summary, it doesn't matter, because it gives the person a chance to give you an insight into another way of looking at it. So lots of skills there. You probably do already use them. Perhaps the most difficult one is to make sure that you go into an interview without being judgmental of the person. And they can take you by surprise. So you kind of learn about yourself in this process as well. There actually aren't any particular set rules or formulas. It is about learning by doing it. You will build on the existing skills that you have. And I do think, as I said before, the best thing to do is to practice. You can read the textbook, and I've got another resource there as well, Qualitative Research Methods. So do all of that reading. That might help. But you have to go out there and actually do it to learn how to do it yourself and in your own style. We do interviews because you actually get a level of depth and complexity that's really not available, particularly using survey-based approaches. So I could have a survey with totally open questions, but I will still get more depth and complexity when I sit down and take the time to listen to someone. Sure, surveys are quick, that's fantastic, and it is a problem that there's the time involved in interviews, but the benefit is that you get to understand a topic from a person's perspective in a whole lot more detail. So you get access to somebody's experiences, you get access, what's happened to them in their lives, you get access to their belief system and why they believe what they do, and their values as well. And as I think I said several weeks ago, with Erving Goffman's a quote, I had a quote from Erving Goffman to say that everything is explicable when you see it from the other person's point of view. So even if it's something that you don't get, imagine sitting down with an ISIS person, for example, but if you did and you understand that you might not agree with their point of view, that's actually fine, but you would understand their point of view, so you can do that in an interview. As I said, lots of flexibility. You can do this anywhere. You can do it over the phone. You can do it in a cafe. You can do it in a restaurant. It also is a great way to explore with people views that aren't very widely known. So if I think back to the example that we had weeks ago, the ethical dilemma of people going and doing covert research, if I wanted to explore people who are doing things that aren't particularly well discussed or are very stigmatized, like people having sex in toilets, homosexual sex in toilets, which at the time was a very suppressed view, then doing that sort of covert participant observation is one way of doing it. Another way would be, and if you had access to the community, would be to sit down and talk to people about it. So interviews with former prisoners, for example, that would be a good way to do that. We talked about people who identify as witches a couple of weeks ago. Again, interviews are fantastic for that because you can get behind the scenes and understand why people do what they do. You can also tackle some quite sensitive issues as well, sometimes unexpectedly. I remember in one of the first interviews that I did, I was interviewing somebody about their religious beliefs, and what they told me about, though, was about child sexual abuse that they'd experienced. And naive as I wasn't expecting to find that or to hear that. But it was actually a way for a woman to talk about what had happened to her. It was a very sensitive issue. She was quite anxious by the time she got to the interview. I didn't help matters. I didn't know she was going to talk about that. I didn't help matters by being late because I was on the other side of the world in an unfamiliar place. I didn't know how to get to this place, so it took me a while and I was running late, by which time she was extraordinarily anxious, which I didn't get. And perhaps I was judgmental when I was thinking, well, why are you so upset? I am a little bit late, but I'm here and I rang you beforehand, blah, 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 blah. However, when I heard her story, then I could understand why she was distressed and anxious and wondering whether she really would tell me this story. But it gave her an opportunity to talk about something that she had not talked about outside of a therapeutic setting, and it was a very important subject. It was a point of view on a particular religion that I hadn't come across before, but did in other settings later on. Gives you lots of depth because you do spend, and I'm sure that you've had that situation, the deep and meaningfuls with people. That's when you get down to the feelings, the emotions, to understanding what's most important to somebody. And that's what an interview is fantastic for, and why I love to do them. And I guess you can really understand the complexity of an individual's life and the complexity of the world as well, because what people do does make sense when we take the time to listen to them, and therefore research can reflect that huge amount of differences amongst us all, and yet in many ways we're all the same as well. So it is used by those of us who tend to favour an ontological position which really values people's knowledge, their own values, their experiences as meaningful and as worthy of exploration. And I'm one of those. I do think that's the best thing to do. So I tend not to take what might be called an expert position and say that I know all about your life. That's not the view that I would hold. I would want to hear about how you experience your life, because you're the expert in your life. However, that said, and I think that's very important, I think it's important to remember that interviews do produce a very particular representation or account of one person's views and opinions. And therefore, you can't take those interviews and generalise that research. So you can't take the interview with the witches, for example, and say that all people who identify as witches view this as a kickback or a pushback against Christianity, for example. You can't say that, because you would get a fair variety of views in there. That might be one person's view, but it's not the whole meaning. So the aim of the interview, you need to understand why you're doing the study and what it is that you want to gain from it. So you need to think about that. I wanted to just draw your attention to the difference between data collection and data generation, which might be just a pedantic point. That usually when we're talking about data collection, we're gathering data in kind of survey style. But when we generate data, we're really thinking about the researcher and the research participant as kind of co-producing data. So you're generating it rather than just collecting it, because what happens in an interview is, and the data that you generate is really the result of the interaction between the researcher and the interviewee. So even if I did say, a podcast or a vodcast or something like that, and I was pretending that I was being interviewed, that would be quite different to what I said. What I would say in that would be quite different to somebody interviewing me, because it's in that interaction that you generate particular data. Or even if somebody, one person interviews me and somebody else does, then that would be quite different. I remember one occasion when I was being interviewed by a researcher, and I did not think she was very good, I have to say, because I was left feeling as if I had things to say, and she wasn't probing deeply enough. And I am one of those persons who tends to wait to be encouraged to continue speaking. And so there were things that I felt as if I didn't feel as if I had everything to say. So now somebody else could do a similar interview and notice that it was a phone interview, so I take that into account. That could be a little bit different. But somebody else might pick up on my hesitation, or that I was pausing to think, and instead of rushing to the next question, ask me a probing one and get a whole lot of different information. So that's what I mean that we generated. It is about the two of us working in tandem in producing that particular data. So it's very different from the survey approach. So researchers are often using interview material, both a resource and as a topic. So you might be using the interview data, all of that data that you've got, as a topic for conversation, but also as a resource for exploring a particular topic like child sexual abuse as well. So you want to learn from the expertise of those that you've been talking with. And interviews can also be analysed for what the people say about their lives, the interviewees, and their experiences. So that's in the way in which you see them as a resource, but also how the information is communicated and the accounts that are told. So the interview topic as well. So in the case of, say, child sexual abuse, we might want to talk about the way in which people haven't talked about that over the years, and we might want to talk about the fact that people find that a very difficult topic to talk about, and that many people are actually much older before they do want to go there, want to go near the pain of that often. And so sometimes that is about a sense of maturity, or perhaps the pain gets too much. So that's in a situation in which that becomes a whole topic about how people talk about something rather than just as a resource what they say. I hope I've made that distinction clearer. Happy to talk about that in workshops if you'd like to. Right, so you do have to do some planning. You need to be thinking about who's going to be interviewed and why. You have to have a reason. You can't just bother people because you like to do interviews, as I do. You need to consider how many people will be interviewed and the number of times that they'll be interviewed, and how long that's all going to take, whether you're going to do one interview or a follow-up. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about as well is when to know when to stop. So who will be interviewed and why, that very much depends on your research topic. I've done a number of interviews now. I've been interested in a couple of religious traditions where they do spiritual healing. And so I've been interested in women's experience of that. So I've done that for my honours project, and I've done that for my PhD project as well. I've done a number of interviews for the long history of foster care project that I've just finished, or the data collection for that. And I interviewed people there, people who were in foster care as kids. I interviewed people who had worked as foster carers. And I also did some interviews, not very many, but some interviews with people who had been the biological children in a foster care family where foster children came in as well. So it depends on your project, who you're going to be interviewing, and that's also then going to determine the sort of questions that you'll ask. How many will be interviewed will depend a little bit on your project. So we have honours students who do interviews, for example, and we would normally recommend about 6 to 8 interviews. Some people love to do more, and I know one person who did about 19 interviews, which is extraordinary for an honours project, but they weren't necessarily very long. So it depends a little bit on whether you're going to do structured interviews, which I'll talk about in a minute, or semi-structured, which might take a lot longer. How many times will it? Again, that will be dependent on the sort of project that you're doing. So most of the interviews that I've done have been ones where I've interviewed them once only. In a way, sometimes I've regretted that. I think it would have been better, say, for the long history of foster care project, for example, to set up another follow-up interview, perhaps even a shorter one, so that we could cover the things they wanted to talk about first of all, and then maybe later on that might generate some more trigger some memories for them that they want to talk about. And the reason why I've had that regret is because I've received interviews from people, I've received emails from people afterwards, and they've remembered a little bit more. And so we only set up the ethics to do one interview with everyone, and I didn't change it. But I think if I were to do that sort of project again, I would make allowances for doing 2 interviews, and of course that would be optional for the person. So it does depend a little bit, and it is about learning. And I've been doing interviews now for many years, but I'm still learning, as you can hear. When do you know when to stop in an interview? The best interviews that I've done, I get to the point where I feel as if the room is empty, as if we've said everything that there is to say on this particular topic. So that's what I call a saturation point. So that's kind of the best. Probably at the other end of the spectrum, I've stopped much earlier if somebody seems to be reluctant to talk. That happens very rarely. Perhaps another time where I intervened and stopped, and it wasn't that saturation point. It was more like I had enough, and I'd had enough data from the person. We'd gathered as much information as I needed for my project, and I'd had enough of listening to this particular person, which isn't a criticism of them. It's just that I was tired. We'd been talking for more than an hour and a half, so I was getting tired. I'd had enough in that sense. But the person was on a roll, and she was talking and talking and talking. So in that sense, there wasn't saturation, but I did intervene and do some closed-ended questions, which kind of brought it to a close a little bit. Again, so, that there isn't anything concrete there that I can give you, except to say that you have to learn yourself when enough is enough. And some people do need to talk. Some people haven't talked about a subject, and they need to, and and I do like to respect that, but by the same token, I also have to accept the fact that I can get tired too, and that I might not be attending very well if I'm letting somebody just ramble on. What do you ask them, and how will you record the interviews? Well, what you ask them depends on your project, and you will have gathered lots of information from doing a literature review beforehand, usually. And so you'll have questions to ask them. You'll have questions because you will have found out something about them during the organisation process of sending out material, making sure that they fit the participant criteria for your project. Even perhaps somebody might have told you something about them, and that's how come you're going to interview them in the first place. So you build on all of that information, but still have an openness to things that they want to tell you. It is a good idea to record the interviews, and that's part of the ethics procedure anyway. You'll need to tell ethics whether you're going to record or video. Recording is absolutely the best thing to do. I haven't ever done a video, and I'm not sure that I would, but maybe I would. I'll leave that open. For most of the interviews that I've done, it's been appropriate just to do a recording. And I do a recording because you can't hear everything. And you can't attend to everything if you're taking notes. And if you're not taking notes, then you miss lots of stuff as well. So you need somehow to gather this information and have it all in one place. And so a recording and then a transcription of that recording is absolutely ideal. If you could do a video recording, then you'd probably gather some other information afterwards as well. And that might be good if I'm just kind of thinking aloud here. A video recording might actually really work if you were doing follow-up interviews, because you might then want to replay that and see what you've missed in terms of body language and a few signals, and then you might formulate some questions to go and talk to the person a second time over that. So that's some options. So you can take notes. I don't recommend it, but sometimes you might need to. And some sort of audio recording equipment, which is very good these days and not expensive. That's ideal. You might be able to do a video recording if you had the permission and there was some reason. You'd need to have a reason for doing that as well. You can also come away from an interview and just make notes. And just to tell you about another mistake that I've made, and that is to not have my recording equipment working properly when I did an interview, and I wasn't going to be able to speak to this person again. It was a one-off interview and I already knew that. So I got to the end of it, discovered that I hadn't recorded it properly, and then I had to very quickly make notes and try to write down as much of that story as I could possibly remember. Unsatisfactory, made me feel awful, don't want to do it again. Recommend that you absolutely make sure that you've got batteries for your recording equipment, that you know how to use it properly, that you've tested it, and that you do check it when you start off doing an interview, because it's not a good thing to be left without all of that recording. All right, so when and for how long? I think I've just covered that. It's going to depend a little bit on the other person's time as well. And so I won't talk about that so much anymore, but where will each respondent be interviewed? I always negotiate that. I have interviewed people in their homes. I haven't invited anyone to my home where they've been a research participant, but I've been interviewed in my home. I've interviewed in restaurants, I've interviewed in cafes. If you interview in a public place, you do need to have really good equipment, and I do now. I have fantastic recording equipment which historians use, and that picks up the conversation very, very well, regardless of the ambient sound. However, another mistake that I've made I have done a recording with somebody in a restaurant, and it's been fairly loud, and my recording equipment wasn't as good as it could be. So this was the early stages of me doing interviews, and I got that interview all down. The equipment didn't fail, but when I was transcribing it, I had to go back and I had to go back and I had to go back in order to hear that properly. So that was not very good. So if you do a public place, consider that you've got really good recording equipment, and if it is too loud, then perhaps try and go somewhere that's you're going to be a little bit quieter. You can use public libraries as well. Public places are a very good idea. So that you can make sure that everybody feels safe in that as well, because the person doesn't know you either, so you need to consider that they're going to feel safe and that you will feel safe as well. Gaining access to people, that depends again on how you on what your research question is, whether you send out invitations. These days Facebook is obviously a way of sending out invitations to people to participate in a research project. Gatekeepers are people who will let you into a group of people that they know of. So when I was doing my PhD project, I was looking at a particular religious community, and there were many people who had already left this religious community, and they knew me from, online chats and things like that. I had known me over the years. So, and they were people who belonged to the LGBTI community, for example, and they had left the religion. But because they knew me and knew that I was inclusive anyway, that I, didn't come from a conservative bent, they were happy to post my interview information on one of their websites that I actually didn't have access to. But they posted that for me, and I got a number of people come to me to talk via that way. So gatekeepers are the people who will let you in or keep you out of a community if they don't think that you're a savoury or trustworthy character. And you can go to particular groups, like, if I was going to do a research project around the university and talk to mature age students or talk to international students, then I would do purposive sampling and go to the Mature Age Students Association and approach them as the gatekeepers, and the same with the International Students Association. Or you can just do a very public one. I've done radio around the foster care project, for example. So I went on the radio. I teed that up with the marketing group here at the University of Adelaide. They did a press release, so they organised all that for me, and then I went on radio as people responded to the university's press release, and that was very public then. And then I received a number of people to interview via that process as well. So it depends a little bit on your project, always depends on your project, and how willing, I guess, you are to go public to invite people into your project as well. Whether you have information sheets and consent forms, well, you will have to have those if you're doing anything with an organisation where there's an ethics committee involved. So an information sheet spells out the entire project to the prospective participants, so they know what you're going to be doing. They kind of have an idea of what you're going to be talking about, even though they won't know all the questions, and they'll know what you're going to do with the information as well, so that we're really open and honest. This is not covert research at all. And then they sign a consent form, and you need to have a copy of that. I've already talked about this other last point on this slide about tape recording or recording in some way. Recording equipment is absolutely the best way to do that. If you're going to use your mobile phone, just a little bit of a warning there, yet another mistake that I've made. I couldn't, on one recording that I did, get it off my phone and onto the computer. I actually these days use specialist equipment where I have, when I just, plug the recording equipment via a USB port on it into my computer and it uploads, but I had trouble with the app on a mobile phone. So make sure that you can transfer your recording from one device to another as well. Well, who I am present barriers, and the barriers are you want people to be speaking to you, so you don't want barriers, because interviews are about getting, as I said before, quite up close and personal with people, especially the sort of interviews that I do, which are semi-structured, in-depth interviews. So sometimes who I am will present as a barrier to people because I hold a position of influence within the university and therefore within the community. And so how I overcome that is, if I'm going to go and talk to somebody who's comes from a quite poor area, then I would just wear jeans and sneakers and stuff like that. So I play down. There's no way I'd front up, for example, wearing a fancy, not that I wear a fancy suit anyway, but I wouldn't wear a fancy suit because I would not want all of that coded clothing to present as a barrier between people. So you need to consider that who you are maybe. For some people, it may be that they're very young, could present as a barrier to people if they were older and didn't feel as if the young person, if they were a bit ageist, that might present as a barrier. So it can, who you are may present as a barrier. The question being asked here is, will you need to provide support strategies? And the response to that is yes, certainly for most of the research that I do. And again, this is a requirement of the ethics process. I need to tell the ethics committee what it is that I'm going to provide by way of support to people. And so that might be Lifeline at a bare minimum. It might be specialist services. So for the foster care project, there's a service, an agency in Adelaide run out of Relationships Australia called Elm Place, and that's a service for people who've been in out-of-home care or state care as children. And so I needed to make sure that I had all of that information and provided that to people. One project that I did, and this was with young people who'd been in out-of-home care as children in foster care or residential care. Part of the requirement was that I, or the person that I was working with on the project, would contact a person if they got distressed during the focus group. We were running focus groups. That one of us would contact that young person the next day and check in to make sure that they're okay. I think that's actually a very good practice to have where you're doing any sort of research with very sensitive topics, where you might be triggering some memories and in the process causing some discomfort or distress for someone. How do you plan to analyse the interview material? Well, I'm not going to talk about that now. We're going to talk about that in the following week. You'll end up with so much data, so we'll leave that question for now. You can do very formal questionnaire-based interviews at one end of the spectrum. That's a very structured interview, to totally open-ended interviews that might begin with a single prompt, such as tell me about your life, if you're doing an oral history interview. So there's a whole range of them. The most common type is the face-to-face, the one-on-one. You can't do them over the phone. I don't think they work so well over the phone. I've been interviewed over the phone, as I said before, didn't think it worked so well. I've done interviews with somebody on the phone, and I don't think that's worked so well either. I think it got a little bit better as I got better at recording and not taking notes at the same time, but you do miss a lot of information, all of that body language. You miss all of that, you miss some of the rapport building when it's over the phone. So if you can do face-to-face, that's what I'd recommend. So the structured interviews are where you have set questions in a particular format, and you might do that if you want to compare information by a set of people, particular population of people. So if you wanted to interview refugees, for example, and you wanted to see if they all had similar experiences, then you would ask particular questions and you would set that up so that everything is kind of correlating with each interview. The semi-structured is the sort of interview that I usually do, where I don't have I go in with some ideas, and I go in with some prompt questions and some things that I definitely want to cover. But apart from that, I leave it to be as free-ranging as possible, so that the interviewee is the person who directs the interview in many regards. So it allows me to follow up and explore questions in a lot more depth than you're able to do in a structured environment. And in the workshops, I'll give you a taste of both of those so that you can see and feel the difference between the two of them. Really unstructured, you wouldn't go into an interview with anything. I'm not sure who does those, maybe historians do, but I think we all have done some research before we go into an interview, so I'm not sure that they're ever totally unstructured, but I'll put that up there as another option. But the power issue is really important. Anne Oakley was an early feminist who critiqued those structured interviews because really they were based, she argued, on that sort of the idea of the detached, the neutral researcher, and where the researcher maintains complete control of the interview. And think about, you know, if you go to an interview with a doctor, it feels as if the doctor is the one in charge. Whereas the sort of interview that she liked to do and the sort of interview that I like to do is that sense where there's a non-hierarchical relationship between the two of us, so that we can both be kind of involved in that conversation, even though it's not a conversation really, because it's not about me, it is about the person that I'm interviewing. Different types of questions. You'd want to have some introductory questions, so you explain again the purpose of the interview, check with them that they've understood the process, that they've understood that this is completely voluntary and they can opt out at any time. So that sort of introductory thing to make sure that everybody's comfortable, they understand the questions on the consent form before that's all signed off. Then you'll have your key questions that you will be asking around your particular project, and it's very project dependent. And then you'll have a range of questions which are about, well, tell me a little bit more about that, or you said before that you'd had this experience of discomfort in that situation. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? So you want to get a little bit deeper as well. And then you'll have summing up questions, you know, so you told me about this and you've told me about that. Can you tell me a little bit about that, or have I understood that correctly? So you want to sum up what the person has said. So there's a range of ways in which you'll ask questions, and initially that will feel a bit uncomfortable as you're thinking about, well, is this an introductory one, or I'm onto the key questions yet? But eventually that will just feel automatic as well. It is a good idea to go in with an interview guide where you really got themes in there, not so much questions, but certainly things that you might want to cover. So the sort of things that I had with former foster children, for example, were when they first went into care, how many times they'd been in foster care, because many people have multiple placements, what that was like for them, whether they had some people that they were happy with, etc., etc. So, and from my research, I would also have other questions that would lead, as you know, somebody might tell me that when they left care that they felt abandoned at age 18 because they were kind of on their own. So if I'd heard that in one interview, then that might be something that I would have asked somebody else later on. Things to avoid when you're thinking about questions is make sure, you know, work out your jargon and make sure that you're keeping the wording appropriate for the interview. And it's a good idea to test that with people who aren't in your field of research, because they're the ones who'll pick up on the jargon. It's the things that people don't understand. Double-barreled questions, these are mistakes that I still make, even though I know that I shouldn't ask a double-barreled question. So the example I've got here, have you and your partner ever considered separating or going to see a counsellor? So I've asked that as one question, but in actual fact it's two questions. And what happens when you ask a double-barreled question is the person for a moment doesn't know in which direction to go. So better to just ask those separately. So have you and your partner ever considered separating? One question. Have you considered going to see a counsellor? Another question. Is the question too vague? Well, you need to consider that vague questions then tend to produce vague answers. You know, for example, what services do older people need in this area? That's pretty vague. You might want to hone in on, do older people need services that include contact with young people, for example? So think about specific services that might be relevant. Is the question biased or misleading? And I have to say, when I've seen some surveys with around the refugee things, I've seen a bit of bias and some leading questions, really. So the example I've got here is that it is important to have regular breast examinations. So you're already telling somebody that you think it's important. So rather than ask them if they think it's important. So not everybody thinks that's an important thing. And so therefore you don't want to present your own view. And sometimes that takes a little bit of practice as well. Have you assumed too much knowledge? So consider that as well. So the example I've got here is, do you agree or disagree with the South Australian Generational Health Review? Well, for example, that's a bit too much like a test, and has the person ever heard of it? Would they know what's in it? So don't assume too much knowledge. If you wanted to ask a question about that, then you would first of all need to canvass with them whether they've ever even heard that particular report. And make sure that you're not being patronising or insulting as well. And again, you need to remember that approach of, I'm coming into this and I'm going to be open, and I'm not going to criticise, and I'm not going to be judgmental. Easier said than done, but we do need to practice doing that. So asking somebody, something like, well, tell me about the ways that you failed as a parent, might be like a dagger through the heart of somebody. Not a very nice thing to ask. And I've put up an example there of how not to do an interview to give you a laugh and to show that you can ask questions which are really insulting, and that's the one with Rowan Atkinson. Is the question intrusive? Well, if you've set it up to be asking questions about how much people earn, so it's a financial sort of interview, then a question about how much money they currently earn might not be seen as intrusive. But if that's off topic and it's not really relevant, then in some communities asking how much people earn is regarded as intrusive. So you've got to think about that and test with the person whether it's relevant, whether you really need to know whether it might be received as intrusive, whether you can ask a prior question that will soften that a little bit if you absolutely must know. Pilot your interview schedule is a good idea. Do that, because it's a good idea to think about whether you've got double-barrel questions, whether you've got jargon in there, whether they're going to understand. So it's a good idea to do that with your interview schedule, but it is also a good idea to practice interviews as well. You need to be able to establish rapport, and really that, I think, means being friendly and hospitable, making somebody attending to them, to their physical needs, to make sure that they're comfortable and at ease and are going to trust you. You need to be using all of your communication and listening skills, and knowing when you're going too far. If somebody seems to be really uncomfortable with something, then you need to, your intuition, know when to back off a little bit as well. As I said, it's like a duck on the water pond. You're going to be doing a lot of work underneath one. It just feels as if you're having a really easy time of it. Open questions are ones that, who did you talk about that with? What did you do on the weekend? When did that happen? Why? Why I'm not super keen on, because it can come across as critical, but a lot of that is about tone, rather than closed questions like, do you like that custard? Did you do that on the weekend? Are you happy? Is that a good vibe for you? So the closed questions invite yes or no responses. The open questions invite a much more elaborate response, bearing in mind, as I said, that some people will talk regardless of how you frame the question, and other people won't say very much even if you have very open questions. Use your prompts. Tell me about more. Make sure that you're nodding encouragingly and attentively. Make sure that your language is open as well, so don't have your arms crossed, so that you're sending a signal of openness and interest. asking questions, think about the sequence there. I tend to like to do the demographic sort of stuff up first, makes sense, so that you can get rid of that more, you know, it's not entirely superficial, but more superficial information out of the way, and then get into stuff that's a little bit deeper. Closing the interview, that's where you perhaps would use some of your closed questions. You know, is there anything else that you might like to say? Make sure that if you're doing interviews around sensitive topics, that you remind the person about the support information that they've got, remind them about how you're going to use the information, make sure that you follow up on anything that you've said. You know, if you're going to get back to the person on something, then make sure that you do that. So close it off, give the person space to come out of the depth of it and just go back to something that's a bit light and easy. And the weather's always a fantastic topic to have for light and friendly conversation. Things for you to think about: how are you going to record it? I've discussed that at length, so I'm not going to talk anymore. The handwritten notes. What will you do if the person doesn't want to be taped? Then you might need to handwrite some notes, and I've discussed that already. Make sure you check your equipment. I can't say that enough. Check your equipment. Make sure that it's working, because it's awful when it doesn't. Are you doing a content and discourse analysis? We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, so we'll leave that for now. Do you need your interview material in electronic form for computer coding? You need to think about that, and therefore you need to be able to transfer it from one device to another, and I've explained the problems that I've had with a mobile phone. Organise your material as you go. Make sure you store all your consent forms. Make sure that you've got your you know, if you can do your transcripts as you go, that's a really good thing to do as well. If you're taking notes, make sure that you take notes. Keep them in an orderly fashion so that you can find your information as you go. How busy you are will make that harder to do, as I've found out. It's hard to keep organised when you're running from one thing to another, but it is better if you can, or keep organised, because then you can just lay your hands on stuff straight away. In summary, I've talked about this quite a lot, but I wanted to just finish off by saying you already have lots of interpersonal skills that you can call on to do interviews, so it's not something completely new and different. Interviews yield enormously rich, fabulous data when they're conducted very well. Studies using interviews are non-probability ones, but that doesn't mean to say they're not valuable. I think they're enormously valuable. I love doing them. And that's about all that I have on interviews. So thank you very much for patiently listening if you've managed to get this far. Thank you.